State Nicknames, Part 1.
A nickname is a shortened form of a person's name. A nickname can also be a descriptive name for a person, place, or thing. America's 50 states have some of the most historically interesting nicknames. Alabama is known as the Heart of Dixie because it is in the very middle of a group of states in the Deep South. Dixie itself is a nickname for the American South. It started when Louisiana printed notes with the French word for 10 on them. Dix, or D-I-X, led to Dixie. Way up north, Alaska is called the last frontier for understandable reasons. Near the Arctic Circle, it was the final part of the nation to be explored and settled. Arizona is the Grand Canyon state because of the famous winding canyon carved by the Colorado River. The southern state of Arkansas is the land of opportunity. The state legislature chose this nickname. Arkansas is rich in natural resources and has become a favorite place for older people to retire. In a popular Spanish book, a fictional island called California was filled with gold. Sure enough, plenty of it was discovered in the real California in 1848. This started a gold rush unlike any other in American history in the Golden State. You would think Colorado would be known as the Rocky Mountain State, but its nickname is the Centennial State. That is because it became a state in 1876, exactly 100 years after the nation declared its independence. Connecticut is called the Nutmeg State, after a spice. Connecticut Yankees, as people in this northeast state are called, are known to be smart in business. So smart that it was said they could sell wooden, meaning false, nutmegs to strangers. Little Delaware is called the first state because it was the first state, the first to approve the new United States Constitution. The southern state of Florida likes to tell about its sunny days and fine beaches. So Florida is the Sunshine State. Florida's neighbor to the north grows some of the sweetest fruit in America. So Georgia is the Peach State. Hawaii, far out in the Pacific Ocean, is the Aloha State. That is the friendly greeting that means both hello and goodbye in the native Hawaiian language. So, aloha for now. Next week, we will tell you about the nicknames of more American states.
State Nicknames, Part 2.
As we told you last week, every American state has a nickname. Here are some more of them. Idaho is known as the Gem State. This is not because it has diamonds, but because it believes it is the jewel of the western Rocky Mountains. Illinois is the land of Lincoln. It is named for Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president who led the nation through the Civil War in the 1860s. The Midwestern state of Indiana is called the Hoosier State, but nobody is quite sure why. One story is that the word was used to mean poor farmers or uneducated people. No wonder the state legislature instead calls Indiana the Crossroads of America. Iowa's nickname, the Hawkeye State, is in honor of Black Hawk, an Indian chief who spent most of his life in neighboring Illinois. Kansas also has a hawkish nickname, the Jayhawk State. Jayhawkers were Free State guerrilla fighters opposed to the pro-slavery fighters in the years before the Civil War. Kentucky is the Bluegrass State. Bluegrass is really bright green, but looks bluish from a distance. Louisiana is the Bayou State. A bayou is a slow-moving stream. Hundreds of them flow through this southern state, and many are full of alligators. Maine, in the nation's northeast, is the Pine Tree State because it is covered in evergreen woods. And directly across the country on the Pacific coast is the state of Washington. It also has lots of evergreen trees, so, not surprisingly, it is the Evergreen State. The eastern state of Massachusetts is the Bay State. This body of water separates most of the state from famous Cape Cod. 6 state nicknames are taken from native animals. Michigan is the Wolverine State. A wolverine is a small, fierce mammal. The badger is a similar and equally fierce creature, and Wisconsin is the Badger State. Neighboring Minnesota, the Gopher State, is named for a much nicer animal that builds hills and tunnels. However, the land of 10,000 lakes is written on Minnesota's vehicle license plates. North Dakota gets its nickname, the Flickertail State, not from some bird, but from a little squirrel. South Dakota takes its nickname, the Coyote State, from an animal that thinks flickertails are good to eat. And Oregon, the Beaver State, borrows its nickname from the large, flat-tailed rodent that uses trees to build dams. Next week, we will tell you about more state nicknames, including one that is about people's feet.
State Nicknames, Part 3.
Today, we tell about more interesting nicknames of American states. The Mid-Atlantic state of Maryland is called the Free State. A Baltimore newspaper first called it that during the 1920s, when the manufacture and sale of alcohol were banned for a time. Maryland said it wanted to be free from this prohibition. Mississippi is the Magnolia State. It is named for a tree with big, beautiful white flowers that grows in that hot southern state. The Midwestern state of Missouri is called the Show Me State. The people of that frontier state were once famous for not believing everything people told them. If you visit the western mountain and plain state of Montana, you will know why it is known as Big Sky Country. Nebraska is the only state to have a nickname that honors sports teams. The state university's athletic teams are nicknamed Cornhuskers in recognition of one of the area's chief crops. The state borrowed the Cornhusker nickname from the university. The western desert state of Nevada is called the Silver State. It was once home to many silver mines and towns that grew up around them. Today, most of them are empty ghost towns. New Hampshire, in the northeast area called New England, is the Granite State because of that colorful rock. New Jersey is between the big cities of New York, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It got its nickname, the Garden State, because New Jersey truck farms once provided vegetables to those big cities. New York, which always thinks big, was called the Empire State because of its natural wealth. The most famous Manhattan skyscraper got its name from the state. It is, of course, the Empire State Building. If you get a chance to see a red sunset over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico, you will know why that southwestern state is called the Land of Enchantment. North and South Carolina were one colony until 1729. South Carolina's nickname is the easier of the two. It is the Palmetto State because of a fan-leafed palm tree that grows there. North Carolina is the Tar Heel State. That is because many of the men who worked to gather substances from trees wore no shoes. They would make turpentine from tar and get the black, sticky tar on the heels of their feet. Next week, we will finish telling about the colorful nicknames of American states.
State Nicknames, Part 4.
Today, we finish telling about the interesting nicknames that have been given to the 50 American states. The state of Ohio is in the Midwest. It is named the Buckeye State after a tree that produces nuts similar to chestnuts. The Great Plains state of Oklahoma is called the Sooner State. That is because of a sale of land in 1889. Some people arrived in the territory to claim their land earlier than they were supposed to. They cheated and got there sooner. Pennsylvania's nickname is the Keystone State. Just as a keystone holds together a stone arch, Pennsylvania was seen as holding together the young American Republic. Pennsylvania is also sometimes called the Quaker State. Its founder, William Penn, and most of his followers were members of the Protestant Quaker religion. Rhode Island's nickname is Little Rhodey because of its size. The state is smaller than the area around Los Angeles, California. Tennessee got its nickname, the Volunteer State, because of the bravery of its citizens. They volunteered to join Tennessean Andrew Jackson to defend the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, against the British Army in the War of 1812. Texas is called the Lone Star State. It gets its nickname from the single star on its flag. This represents the short time Texas was an independent nation battling Mexico for self-rule. The Beehive State of Utah has no more beehives than any other state. The nickname is from the Mormon Church's symbol for hard work. The eastern state of Vermont is proud of its beautiful green mountains, so it calls itself the Green Mountain State. The southern state of Virginia is called the Old Dominion. Long ago, King Charles II of England added the colony's coat of arms to his shield. It joined his other dominions of England, Ireland, and Scotland. West Virginia broke away from Virginia in the 1860s. It is called simply the Mountain State for the ancient Appalachian Mountains. And we have saved perhaps the most American nickname for last. The western state of Wyoming was once an area where cattle were transported east. And where there are cattle, there are men, and now women, to move them. So Wyoming is the cowboy state.
American History Series, the North loses the first major battle of the war.
The battle between the North and the South spread in the summer of 1861. Union soldiers fought pro-Southern rioters in the streets of Baltimore and St. Louis. A Confederate supporter shot and killed a young officer from the North. Untrained soldiers from both sides fought in the mountains of western Virginia. So far, though, the fighting had not claimed many lives, but very soon the battle would become fierce. This week in our series, Frank Oliver and Jack Weitzel continue the story of the American Civil War.
The old general who commanded the Union forces, Winfield Scott, did not want to rush his men into battle. Scott believed it would be a long war. He planned to spend the first year of it getting ready to fight. He had an army of thousands of men, and it would get much larger in coming months. But this army was not trained. His soldiers were civilians who knew nothing about fighting a war. General Scott needed time to make soldiers of these men. He also needed time to organize a supply system to get to his forces the guns, bullets, food, and clothing they would need. Without supplies, his army could not fight very long. There were many in the North, however, who thought Scott was too careful. It was true, they said, that Union forces were untrained, but so were those of the South, and the Confederacy's supply problems were even greater than those of the Union. The South had much less industry and fewer railroads. It could not produce as much military equipment, and it could not transport supplies as easily as the North could. In the early months of the war, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, did not even have guns enough for the men in his army. Those who demanded immediate action expected a short war. They said Scott should take the army and march to Richmond. They were sure that if Union forces seized the Confederate capital, the Southern rebellion would end. Northern newspapers took up the cry, "On to Richmond." Political leaders began pressing for a quick Northern victory. Public pressure forced the army to act. For more than a month, General Irvin McDowell had been building a Union army in northern Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington. He had more than 30,000 men at bases in Arlington and Alexandria. Late in June, McDowell received orders: march against the Confederate army of General Pierre Beauregard. Beauregard had 20,000 soldiers at Manassas Junction, a railroad village in Virginia, less than 50 kilometers from Washington. McDowell planned to move on Manassas Junction July 9th, but was delayed for more than a week. He planned the attack carefully. McDowell was worried that another large Confederate force west of Manassas Junction might join Beauregard's army. This force, led by General Joe Johnston, was in the Shenandoah Valley near Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Across from Harper's Ferry in Maryland was a Union army almost twice the size of Johnston's. It was ordered to put pressure on Johnston's force to prevent it from helping Beauregard.
General Beauregard received early warning from Confederate spies that McDowell would attack. Much of his information came from a woman, Mrs. Rose O'Neill Greenhow. Mrs. Greenhow, a widow, was an important woman in Washington. She knew almost all the top government officials, and she had friends in almost every department of the government. The beautiful Mrs. Greenhow also had some very special friends. One was Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. He was chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Another special friend was Thomas Jordan, a Confederate colonel in Beauregard's army.
Jordan asked Mrs. Greenhow soon after the war started to be a spy for the South. She agreed and sent much valuable information about Union military plans. Early in July, she sent word to Beauregard that he would be attacked soon. She also sent a map used by the Senate Military Affairs Committee showing how the Union Army would reach Manassas Junction. Then, on the morning of July 16th, Mrs. Greenhow wrote a 9-word message. She gave it to a man to carry to Beauregard. The Confederate general received it that evening. It said, "Order given for McDowell to march upon Manassas tonight."
Beauregard sent a telegram to Richmond. He told the Confederate government that McDowell was on the way. He asked that Johnston's 10,000-man force in the Shenandoah Valley join him for battle. He was told to expect Johnston's help. But Johnston's army was threatened by a large Union force that entered Virginia from Maryland. Led by General Robert Patterson, the Union troops moved toward the smaller Confederate force. They were not really interested in fighting Johnston, but they did want to prevent him from reaching Beauregard. Johnston knew he could not defeat Patterson, so he decided to trick him. While most of his army withdrew and prepared to join Beauregard, Johnston sent a small force to attack Patterson's army. Patterson believed Johnston was attacking with all his troops. He stopped moving forward and prepared to defend against what seemed to be a strong Confederate attack. By the time the trick was discovered, Johnston and most of his troops were at Manassas.
General McDowell's huge Union army left Arlington on the afternoon of July 16th. It was a hot day and the road was dusty. The march was not well organized, and the men traveled slowly. They stopped at every stream to drink and washed the dust from their faces. Some of the soldiers left the road to pick fruits and berries from bushes along the way. To some of those who watched this army pass, the lines of soldiers in bright clothes looked like a long circus parade. Most of these men had not been soldiers long. Their bodies were soft and they tired quickly. It took them 4 days to travel the 45 kilometers to Centerville, the final town before Bull Run. The battle would start the next morning, Sunday, July 21st.
The road from Washington was crowded early Sunday morning with horses and wagons, bringing people to watch the great battle. Hundreds of men and women watched the fight from a hill near Centerville. Below them was Bull Run. But the battleground was covered so thickly with trees that the crowds saw little of the fighting. They could, however, see the smoke of battle, and they could hear the sounds of shots and exploding shells. From time to time, Union officers would ride up the hill to report what a great victory their troops were winning.
In the first few hours of the battle, Union forces were winning. McDowell had moved most of his men to the left side of Beauregard's army. They attacked with artillery and pushed the Confederate forces back. It seemed that the Confederate defense would break. Some of the Southern soldiers began to run, but others stood and fought. One Confederate officer, trying to prevent his troops from moving back, pointed to a group led by General T.J. Jackson of Virginia. "Look," he shouted, "there is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Fight like the Virginians." The Confederate troops refused to break. The fighting was fierce. The air was full of flying bullets. A newsman wrote that the whole valley was boiling with dust and smoke. A Confederate soldier told his friend, "Them Yankees are just marching up and being shot to hell." Neither side would give up. Then a large group of Johnston's troops arrived by train and joined in the fight. Suddenly, Union soldiers stopped fighting and began pulling back. General McDowell and his officers tried to stop the retreat, but failed. Their men wanted no more fighting.
The fleeing Union soldiers threw down their guns and equipment, thinking only of escape. Many did not stop until they reached Washington. It was a bitter defeat, but it made the North recognize the need for a real army, one trained and equipped for war. President Abraham Lincoln gave the job of building such an army to General George McClellan.
Non-formal schools aim to fill need in Kenya's slums.
In 2003, the government of Kenya established a program of free primary education for all children. But there are not enough public schools for all the children who live in the crowded slums of Nairobi. Instead, some of these children attend what are known as non-formal or informal schools. These are supported by communities, religious groups, and other organizations. Informal schools use the national curriculum taught in public schools, but they operate largely with limited resources and without trained teachers. Education activists say the Ministry of Education rarely inspects their teaching quality, lesson notes, or examination records. They say the presence of informal schools means that Kenya has two levels of education, one for children from the slums, another for children from better conditions. Activists say Kenya has at least 1,600 of these non-formal schools. Susan Munue is an education ministry official. She says only about 200 informal schools across the country receive money for materials under the free primary education program. She says one slum in Nairobi, Mathare, has only about 3 public primary schools nearby. These can serve 2,000 children at most. But she says the Mathare slum alone has more than 300,000 children of school age. Diana Ateno Tuju volunteers as a teacher at the St. Christine's Community Center in the Kibera slum, one of the largest in Africa. She says the government has provided books for her school only one time during the past few years. Many parents do not have the money to buy books, so sometimes the teachers pay for them. She says many students are sleepy and unable to pay attention in class because there is not enough food for them at home. For the children at St. Christine's, the midday meal they are served might be their only meal all day. A government spokesman says the government is trying to discourage informal schools. Alfred Mutua says every child in Kenya has the ability to get the same education. The government, he says, has never rejected a child from a public school. He also says the government is building more schools, but it will take time.